Hi, Story with Tate in the studio. Welcome back to another episode. And in today's video, I'll show you how I built this white oak display cabinet. Now, it measures in at about 5 feet long by about 32 inches tall and about 18 inches deep. Now, this just displays the various, hi Toby, this just displays the various cutting boards and epoxy and other things in my showroom, just so when I have customers come in, they'll be able to see that. But I'll show you the build and enjoy the video. Now, all of the material I'm using in this project are just leftover pieces from previous projects. Now, the main body is made out of 3/4 inch plywood. Well, it's actually particle board, but it's got a really nice white oak rift cut veneer. Now, because particle board doesn't have a lot of strength in it, I'm actually just sort of doubling up the wall thickness. So I'm taking 2 3/4 inch pieces and I'm just laminating them together with some glue. So basically I'm just sort of taking those pieces, gluing them together, and then taking the other pieces and just gluing them on top. Now this basically is kind of act as a clamp because I don't have a vacuum sealer or anything like that. And then for the last piece, I just piled on a bunch of boards and what have you just to glue all those pieces together. But once I'm done that, the glue is just drying. I've got some leftover, some 8/4 material here, and I'm doing some edge banding on the front of all the pieces there. So I'm just sort of cutting all the pieces to length here, and once I've cut them to length and then I actually rip some strips, I'm just taking them over to the drum sander and I'm just sanding off those burn marks there. And then once they go through the drum sander, they come out with all those burn marks removed and at a glue up spot. Now, after all those pieces have dried, I just take them over to the table saw and I'm just sort of trimming off the edge there. Now, originally I thought that it was about 18 inches on the intro, but the depth of the cabinet came in closer to about 19.5 inches. But yeah, I'm just ripping off the edges there and just cleaning them up on both sides. Now, when it comes to the edge banding, I'm just attaching a bunch of glue to that little strip. Now, it was about 1/4 inch on the cabinet on the outside, and then the shelf, I think I did about a 3/4 inch banding on the front. Now, those pieces are just slightly oversized, so I'm using some tape to kind of glue it into place. I don't think you can see on the video, but it is just overhanging a little bit, so I can run a flush trim bit over the edges. And as you can see here, I'm just really gently running that flush trim bit just so it's nice and even with that plywood there. And yeah, I find this is the best way, because if you cut it to the exact width, 1.5 inch, you just really struggle at trying to make that line up properly. So now I'm just cutting the miter in the cabinet there because it's sort of a 45 degree, and I just use my track saw to do that. I find it's much easier than trying to wrestle with it on the table saw, so I just run it over. And then once I do run it over, I just actually use a little block sander there, and I just slowly sand off all those little fibers that stick out so they don't peel up and wrap around. So now I'm just finally cutting the one piece in half. These are the end pieces, and I'm just doing the pre-cut just at a 90 degree on the table saw there. Now, the heights of those was about I think maybe 26 inches tall or something like that. And then I'm just using my crosscut miter sled here, and I'm just doing the 45 on that side. Now, you will notice that I attached some tape there just because there is a bunch of tear out that does tend to happen on those pieces. But once I've cut that, then I just do the edge, and to join them, I'm just using a few dominoes there, and it just makes the joining much easier. And now I'm finally just doing the dado in the back of the cabinet, and what that does is that's just going to allow the slat for that piece of 1/2 inch plywood that I'm putting on as a backing. Now I just had some birch on hand, so I used that. Now I want an easy way to be able to clamp this together. So what I do is I have this small little strip of plywood and I put a 45-degree angle on it, and then I'm attaching it with some painter's tape and CA glue, and I just sort of space it about a ½ inch from the end. And then the reason I do that is just, again, on this veneer, I don't want to glue directly onto it like I would with say, you know, a solid wood piece, but you can just sort of see those clamps. When I put them together, it just makes a easy clamp on surface so that I can close the gap in the miter. So I got it out of the clamps. The miters turned out pretty good, and so I'm just going to sand the face, and then I'll sand the top. Now, because the veneer is so thin on the plywood, I'm just going to do the 220 grit. If I do any more than that, it might go through and then you'll see the particle board underneath. So, but the front, because I need to line it up, and it's a pretty thick band, it's almost a 1/4 inch. I'm going to do 120 grit and then just take it down, and then I'll run a router over the edge, and then I'll just hand sand the edge, and then I'll do the inside of the cabinet. It's pretty good, but I got a little bit of some of my wet wipe. I got some glue in there and I wiped it off wet wipe so I can feel some rough spots. But yeah, I'll just go ahead and do that and sort of do that final prep sanding. And then I'll probably put a coat of finish on. I gotta cut the shelf. Actually, I completely forgot. I gotta do the pins for the shelf, so I'll make sure I do that first. So I'm using this Craig shelf pin jig. Now, I know there's a lot of different ones on the market, but this is the one I got. Works great for me. It's got a good spacing, and I just go ahead and just drill all those marks, or drill all those holes. And it's nice because you can set it at the bottom, and then there's a pin that you can just sort of add and then sort of keep stacking up so that spacing remains constant. And then once I've done that, I just do a little sanding all over the cabinet. So the front, again, I start off with that 120 grit just to even it out. And then on the sides and the inside, I just do the 220 grit, and I just do that final sanding. Now once that's all said and done, I'm just cutting in that back panel. So again, I'm using the 1/2 inch plywood birch. Probably would have been best to use a white oak plywood, but I didn't have any 1/2 inch, so again, I'm just using what's on hand, and I just use that. Now, once that's done, I just run sandpaper over the edge and just do a hand sanding. Now here I'm moving on to the finishing process, and what I like to do is just attach a Scotch-Brite pad to my sander, and I just run it over with that, and it just works it into the wood grain really easily. And I'm using some Osmo raw finish here, and I find using that sander is kind of a bit of a hack, and it just makes that process a lot faster than trying to do it by hand. So it probably cuts the time in about 1/5 as much time, so that's really nice. So now I'm just sort of doing the feet here. Now just doing something really simple. It's just some vertical pieces. Run it through the jointer, and then going on to the planer and just running it through that way. And once I've done that, I'm just cutting it to the height. And I think they ended up at about 4.5 inches tall, maybe 5 inches tall. I can't remember exactly, but I wanted as much height as I could, just so that I could get the vacuum just under that cabinet. But yeah, I'm just sort of running it through the table saw, and I didn't quite cut it deep enough, so I had to adjust the blade height, and I raised it up. But yeah, just cutting it to the length here, and then after I've cut that to the length, I'm just doing a quick sanding and a round over on the edge, and yeah, just kind of doing that. To attach the feet, I'm going to use these figure-8 clips, and I'll just essentially mount them like that. Now, I've made a jig in the past. So what I do is I use a flush trim bit on this jig, and I just sort of follow it like this, and it cuts the groove for the depth of this. I know some people just use a Forstner bit, but sometimes I have legs where I'm screwing down this way with the Forstner bit and it ends up tearing it all out and it slips out. So instead, I like to use this jig. And the way I set the depth is that I just place it like this, and then I'll just adjust it here. You probably can't see very good in the camera, but I'll move it up. Hopefully you can see that. So I have the flush trim bit, and then here's the figure 8. So hopefully you can see that. I guess I'll find out in editing if I did a good job with that, but yeah, just adjusting it. And then all I really do is I just clamp it to the workpiece like this. Just got a squeeze clamp. Like that. It's all tight. And that's it. So now I got the groove in there, and I can just put that figure 8 clip. So looks like I cut it a bit too low. I'll just adjust this here, just up a touch. But yeah, that's about it. It's a pretty simple process, and that's what works for me. After I've grooved the slots into all those pieces, I just mark the holes with the figure 8 clip, and I just pre-drill those holes. And I ended up attaching it with some number 6 screws that are about an inch long, and I just pre-drill them on the cabinet underneath. Now I set them in, I think it was about 1.5 inches on the front and then the back, and then about 9 inches on the side. And once that's done, I'm just attaching the backing to the cabinet. And I'm just using a countersink bit and some number 8 screws to attach that back panel. And once that's all said and done, the cabinet is done. So I'm glad that you watched the video to the end. I really appreciate it. And if you haven't yet, please share, like, and subscribe. And we'll see you on the next video. Take care. Bye.